Hi, I hope you're well. I'm going to be reading from Hebrews 4 verses 1 to 11. But first, let me pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that it is true, that it is good news to us. Lord, I pray that you would help us to believe your word, that we would take it on and be obedient to it in faith. Help us, Father, to become more like you each day, that we might learn to know you and learn to love you more each day. Amen. Hebrews 4 verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who believed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us, therefore, make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. I don't know about you, but during lockdown, my days have started to mold into one another. My weekends start to feel a little bit like my weekdays. My evenings start to feel a little bit like my daytimes. And this is because I can log into work remotely. I can work just as easily at 10 a.m. as I can at 10 p.m. And often for many of us, this can lead to not being sure when one week ends and another begins. It can lead to a real lack of distinction between our days. And in this time, it's been a real challenge to me. What place does the Sabbath have in my week and in my life? What place does it have in your life? With flexible working, where we can be valuable to our companies and valuable to the economy every day, with no need to be in a particular workplace, is there even any need for a Sabbath anymore? Well, I think Hebrews 4 gives us a really good reason to continue to keep a Sabbath day holy. I think Hebrews 4 shows us that ultimately our earthly Sabbath is a picture, a shadow of a greater Sabbath that is to come. Let's read it in verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short. We see here a great promise, good news. There is rest to come, rest for the weary. But we also see a great warning that some of us might fall short of that rest. What is it, we cry, that might cause us to fall short of rest, of the rest that is promised? Well, let's have a look in verse 2. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. We see then that faith is the thing that qualifies us to enter rest. And so it is unbelief that causes us to fall short. We also see that faith leads us to obedience. It's not the other way round. Obedience does not lead to faith. Faith is not a fruit of obedience. Rather, it's obedience that is a fruit of faith. What value then does the gospel have for those who do not believe? Does it have some value? If they keep some of the rules and commandments found in the Bible, if they try to lead a good life, if they try to attend church maybe once a Sunday or maybe once a year at Christmas time, does that give some value to them? Does the gospel provide some value for those who are trying? Well, the Bible would say no. It says the message they heard was of no value to them. It doesn't matter how good your regular weekly church attendance is. The gospel is of no value to you if you do not believe. What then does the Sabbath have to do with these things? Let's see in verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Here we get a brief flashback to Exodus, where God has rescued his people from Egypt. He has led them through the wilderness, and through Joshua, he has led them into the promised land. And the writer to the Hebrews is trying to show the people he's writing to that promised land was not the ultimate place of rest, that God has not yet fulfilled his promise to his people, but there is a rest to come. And so the promised land is merely a shadow of the rest, the true rest that is to come. Similarly, our earthly Sabbath is a shadow of the greater Sabbath to come. It is a shadow of our eternal rest with God. Let's read a little bit further on into verse 11. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. Once again, at the end of this section, we get a warning to make sure that we enter that rest, that we do not fall short of it. So what am I saying? Am I saying that if I want to get into heaven, if I want to enter the eternal rest of God, I must keep the Sabbath? No, I'm not saying that at all. We've seen very clearly that it is by faith and not by works that we are saved. Faith is the thing that qualifies us to enter that rest. But what I am saying is that a great reason to keep the Sabbath is that the Sabbath reminds us that there is a greater rest to come. That one day we will have an eternal Sabbath with our God in heaven. Another great reason for us to keep the Sabbath is that it gives us an opportunity to look up, to be careful that we enter that rest. For me, I can see the Sabbath sort of like the flags that you see on a beach when you're out swimming or bodyboarding. If you're not careful, you can quickly begin to drift away when you're in the sea. But one look up and you can see those flags on the beach. And you can see whether you are drifting into stormy waters or whether you are still swimming in safe waters. The Sabbath can be like that for us. It can give us an opportunity to look up and to consider whether we have drifted from the true gospel or whether we continue to believe it firmly, whether we continue to hold fast to our confession of faith. What then should our Sabbath look like? Well, it is a day of rest. And so I think it should be a day when we cease from our regular work to focus on God. And if we see that the Sabbath is in part there to remind us of an eternal rest with God, it should be a day that we reserve distinctly to focus on God. Now, I know that for many of us, keeping the Sabbath is not an easy thing. We have many responsibilities, many things to be getting on with. Some of us have have children, and I don't know the challenges of that, but I'm sure there are challenges in keeping the Sabbath when you have children. But I urge you to consider how you might continue to keep the Sabbath during lockdown, that how you may continue to keep one day holy and set apart for the Lord, so that we might continue to remember that one day, ultimately, we will be with him in glory, and so that we can continue to make sure that we don't fall short of that rest. Let me pray. Father, thank you for your Sabbath rest. Thank you that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So it is a gift to us, not merely an obligation for us to keep. Thank you that it is by faith that we are saved and not by our works. Help us, Father, to cling to that true gospel and to never drift from it, that we might be those who one day enter that promise of rest with you. Amen.